1899. A druggist in Boston slides a small glass bottle across the counter. The label calls it a cough remedy, gentle enough for a child, safe enough for your grandmother. The name printed on it, in clean serif letters, is Heroin. No prescription. It sits on the shelf next to the aspirin, made by the same company. Within 2 generations, the addiction crisis it helped seed would kill more Americans than we lost in combat in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. And it started as medicine. This is where it begins. To understand how a cough syrup became a mass grave, you have to go back, way back, long before there was a United States, before there was an England, before anyone wrote anything down. The opium poppy grows a papery flower, red, pink, white, and when the petals drop, they leave behind a swollen green seed pod about the size of a walnut. Score that pod with a blade and it weeps. A milky white sap bleeds out, and as it hits the air, it thickens and darkens to a sticky amber-brown gum, bitter enough to make you gag. That gum is opium. Somebody, thousands of years ago, tasted it anyway. Archaeologists have found domesticated poppy seeds in caves in what is now Spain, carbon dated to somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 years before Christ. People were farming this plant more than 7,000 years before the Declaration of Independence, before the wheel reached most of the world, before bronze. In a cave near Granada, they found the seed pods tucked into little woven grass bags, buried with the dead. You've probably heard that the ancient Sumerians called it the joy plant around 3400 BC. Careful, that one's shaky. It traces back to a single hedged guess a scholar made in the 1920s about one clay symbol, and later writers quietly deleted the hedges. The honest version is simpler and older. Farmers in the Western Mediterranean domesticated this plant in the Stone Age, and the ritual barely changed for thousands of years. Cut the pod at dusk, come back at dawn, scrape the dried tears into a ball. For most of human history, that's what opium was. You ate it, you drank it steeped in wine, later you smoked it. Powerful, yes. A painkiller, a sleep aid, a comfort for the dying, but crude, diluted by the plant itself, slow to hit, impossible to measure. What turned this ancient medicine into the engine of modern addiction wasn't the plant, it was chemistry. In 1804, in a small German town, a pharmacist's apprentice named Friedrich Sertürner did something nobody had managed before. He isolated the single compound inside opium that does most of the work, pulled it out as a pure white crystalline powder. He named it after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. Morphine. Here's what that meant. Raw opium is maybe 10% active ingredient wrapped in plant fiber and sugar and water. Morphine was the thing itself, roughly 10 times stronger, and for the first time in history, something you could measure into an exact dose. A doctor could now hold the full power of the poppy in a glass vial the size of your thumb. For a while, that looked like nothing but a miracle. And then came the second invention, the one that turned the miracle into a trap, the hypodermic syringe. By the 1850s, a hollow needle let a doctor push morphine straight past the stomach, straight into the bloodstream, straight to the brain in seconds. The relief was instant and total. So was something else nobody was ready for. Delivered that way, morphine didn't just kill pain, it rewired the person taking it, fast, into a body that could no longer function without it. America found this out at industrial scale during the Civil War. The Union Army alone issued something on the order of 10 million opium pills and millions of ounces of opium tinctures and powders to its troops. Men came home from the bloodiest war in American history with shattered bodies, a morphine habit, and a needle in their kit. The dependents got a name, soldier's disease. Though honest historians will tell you the term, and the numbers were probably exaggerated later, but the pattern was set, and it kept growing. By the end of the 1800s, opiates were in everything sold at the American pharmacy. Cough syrups, women's tonics, and, this is not a metaphor, teething medicine for babies. One of the best-selling products in the country, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, quieted crying infants with a dose of morphine. Some of those babies never woke up. Picture the American drugstore of 1895. Behind a long marble counter, rows of amber glass bottles catch the light. Laudanum, paregoric, morphine tablets, cocaine tooth drops, a dozen soothing syrups with soothing names. No prescription needed for most of it. A tired mother could walk in off the street, hand over a few cents, and walk back out holding a bottle of opiates strong enough to drop a grown man. Nobody called it dangerous. They called it the pharmacy doing its job. By 1900, the United States had roughly 250,000 people addicted to opiates, about 1 in every 300 Americans. And here's the part that gets erased. The typical addict wasn't a criminal in an alley. She was a middle-class white woman in her 40s, in rural Ohio or Georgia, hooked by the family doctor who was only trying to help. That was the world one German drug company looked at and decided to improve. In 1898, the Bayer company, yes, the aspirin people, who would trademark aspirin the very next year, took morphine, ran it through a simple chemical tweak, and produced a compound about twice as strong. They needed a brand name. They chose one based on the German word heroisch, heroic, because of how powerful, how invincible it made patients feel. They called it heroin, and they marketed it as a non-addictive cure for morphine addiction. They were about to be wrong in the most catastrophic way a company has ever been wrong. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel covers the hidden histories behind the things that shape the world. Real stories, real numbers, no filler. New video every week. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Whether you're in Texas, New York, or somewhere in between, I always want to know. Bayer's pitch was simple, confident, and completely backwards. Heroin was the safe opioid, the one you could hand out freely, a better cough suppressant than anything on the market, and, they claimed in their own literature, a tool to wean morphine addicts off their habit. The medical world believed them. Heroin shipped to more than 20 countries. In the United States, it went straight onto drugstore shelves, sold over the counter with no prescription, in cough drops and elixirs, advertised as gentle enough for children. In its first year on the market, Bayer turned out around 100 pounds of heroin. Within about 15 years, that had climbed to roughly a ton, more than 2,000 pounds a year, shipped around the world as an ordinary household remedy. In 1906, the American Medical Association gave heroin its approval for general use and even recommended it as a substitute for morphine. Think about what that means. The most respected medical body in the country looked at a drug twice as addictive as the one already wrecking American homes and called it the solution. This is the empire heroin actually built. Not a country, not a colony, a system, a fully respectable, white-coated, government-blessed machine that manufactured addiction and stamped the word treatment on the box. The dependence didn't come from back alleys. It came from the family medicine cabinet, from the doctor's bag, from the nursery shelf, sold by brand-name corporations and endorsed by the experts. And when Washington finally acted, it acted with a shrug. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 didn't ban heroin. It just required that the label say what was inside. You could still buy it. You just now knew, in small print, that you were buying it. That's the consequence that never went away. America invented, at the turn of the century, a specific kind of catastrophe. Addiction handed to ordinary people by their own trusted doctors and their own trusted brands. We have a clinical word for it now, iatrogenic, meaning caused by the healer. Hold on to that word, because in about 90 years, a company in Connecticut was going to run this exact play again with a pill called OxyContin, and America was going to fall for it a second time. By around 1910, doctors could no longer pretend. Patients Bayer had cured of morphine were now hooked on something worse, and heroin, being stronger and easier to sniff or inject, was escaping the medicine cabinet and moving onto the street. The miracle was turning into a monster, and the country's answer to that monster would decide the shape of the next 100 years. Here is the part almost nobody knows. As heroin addiction spread, the law slammed down. The Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 taxed and tracked every opiate sale, and federal officials quickly twisted it into a weapon, ruling that a doctor could no longer legally maintain an addict, even to keep them stable. In 1924, Congress went further and banned heroin outright, even for medical use. Overnight, hundreds of thousands of sick Americans became criminals. But the withdrawal didn't care what the law said. If you've never seen an opioid withdrawal, picture this. It starts within hours of the last dose. The sweats come first, then the chills, waves of both at once, so the skin crawls. The muscles in the legs and back seize and cramp so hard, the body kicks involuntarily. That's where the phrase, kicking the habit, comes from watching people's legs jerk on a cot. Vomiting, diarrhea, no sleep for days, every nerve screaming. It rarely kills you. It just makes you certain you're dying. For a week, until the only thought left in your skull is the one thing that makes it stop. So where do you put 250,000 people trapped in that? America built them a farm. In 1935, on 1,000 acres outside Lexington, Kentucky, the federal government opened a $4 million Art Deco fortress, officially called the United States Narcotic Farm. Everyone just called it Narco. It was the most ambitious thing this country has ever attempted with addiction. A prison, a hospital, and a research laboratory fused into one enormous building rising out of the Kentucky bluegrass. When the government first announced it, the local paper ran a contest to name the place, and nearly 800 entries poured in. Hopeful, aching names like the Federal Curative Farm and the 3-in-1 Drug Farm. The building they finally raised looked less like a penitentiary than a cathedral, a soaring Art Deco tower at the center, meant to feel like a temple of second chances. A second, smaller farm opened later outside Fort Worth, Texas, to catch the overflow. This was the scale of the country's hope. America didn't build a clinic. It built a monument to the belief that we could fix this. The whole idea rested on a radical belief that addicts weren't criminals or moral failures. They were sick people who could be healed. Federal inmates were sent there. So were addicts on probation. And, this is the astonishing part, anyone in America could volunteer, check themselves in, and try to get clean, free of charge. Inside, patients worked. They ran a real dairy farm, tended livestock, sewed garments, built furniture, played in the house band. Some of the greatest names in American jazz passed through those halls: Chet Baker, Elvin Jones. The writer William S. Burroughs did a stretch there. Winding up in Lexington became slang, a whole generation's shorthand for hitting bottom. Quick question before we go on. How many Americans do you think are living with an opioid addiction right now? Not in some history book, but today, in 2026. Drop your guess in the comments. I'll give you the real number before this is over, and I promise it's bigger than you think. Now here's the shadow over the farm. Attached to it was the Addiction Research Center, and that's where the ideals got dirty. Researchers ran experiments on the incarcerated addicts, and sometimes paid them for their participation in the currency that mattered most to a hooked man: doses of the drug he was there to quit. During the Cold War, the CIA's secret MKUltra program used the Lexington facility to test drugs on prisoners, dosing them, in some cases, without meaningful consent. And after all of it, the farm, the jazz, the therapy, the science, the number that broke everyone's heart was the relapse rate. Of the addicts who left Lexington believing they were cured, nearly 9 out of 10 were using again, 9 out of 10. And many of the volunteers came back. The same faces again and again, checking in clean, walking out hopeful, turning up at the gate months later, hollowed out, to start over. Lexington didn't just measure relapse on a chart. It watched the same human beings relapse, in person, for decades. That was the lesson buried in those 1,000 acres. This disease doesn't get cured and closed like a broken bone. It has to be managed, for life. That failure taught America the single most important thing it has ever learned about addiction. And America was about to ignore it on purpose. Because in 1964, in a lab at Rockefeller University in New York City, two doctors cracked something Lexington never could. Vincent Dole, an internist, and Marie Niswander, a psychiatrist who would marry a year later, started treating a handful of long-term heroin addicts with a synthetic opioid called methadone. Their finding was quiet and revolutionary. Given the right steady dose, methadone didn't get patients high. It didn't sedate them. It simply switched off the desperate, all-consuming craving and blocked heroin from working if they used it anyway. They called it narcotic blockade. Patients who had been robbing and hustling and nodding off in doorways for a decade were suddenly holding jobs, paying rent, sitting down to dinner with their families. For the first time in the entire history of this drug, someone had a treatment that actually measurably worked, that let a heroin addict live an ordinary American life. For one bright moment, it looked like we'd won. The typical addict was changing too. Heroin was moving into America's cities and, increasingly, into poor black neighborhoods, even as the treatment to help was finally in hand. Add it up, and by the mid-1960s, the United States held two things at the same time: hard proof from Lexington that addiction was a chronic disease, and from Rockefeller, a medicine that could manage it. We had the diagnosis. We had the cure. What I haven't told you yet is that the people running this country looked at that working medical treatment and chose deliberately to build prisons instead. And decades later, one of them admitted, on the record, exactly why. Meet the structural villain of this story. Not a chemist, not a company. A choice made in American offices by American officials and defended for 50 years. The groundwork was laid by a man named Harry Anslinger, who ran the Federal Bureau of Narcotics from 1930 to 1962. For 3 decades, Anslinger sold the country one relentless message: the addict is not a patient, the addict is a criminal, and the answer is not a hospital bed, but a jail cell. His agents didn't just chase dealers. When Dole and Niswander started saving lives with methadone, federal narcotics agents reportedly threatened those doctors, the ones with the working cure, with criminal prosecution for daring to give an addict a maintenance dose. Sit with that. The government's own drug enforcers tried to shut down the treatment that worked. Then, in June of 1971, President Richard Nixon stood before the cameras and declared drug abuse public enemy number 1. He launched what he named the War on Drugs, and 2 years later, created the agency you know as the DEA. And the money, the billions, flowed overwhelmingly in one direction. Not to clinics, not to methadone, to police, to prosecutors, to prisons. America had a disease model sitting in Kentucky and a working medicine sitting in New York. It chose handcuffs. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Now, I went looking for the smoking gun, some internal memo where they priced it all out in cold dollars. It isn't there, and I won't pretend it is. But the arithmetic doesn't need a memo. Methadone maintenance ran a few $1,000s per patient a year, call it the price of a used car once, and gave you back a tax-paying citizen. A year in federal prison ran roughly $40,000 a head every single year, and handed back a person more damage than the one who went in. By the most cited estimates, America has since poured something like $1 trillion into the war on drugs. The treatment was cheaper and it worked. We chose the expensive thing that didn't. This is the part that should make you angry, because it wasn't an accident of good intentions gone wrong. Years later, Nixon's own domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, a man who'd gone to federal prison over Watergate, and by his own telling had nothing left to protect, reportedly told a journalist what the drug war had really been about. The Nixon White House, he said, had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black people. They couldn't outlaw being against the war or being black. So, as Ehrlichman described it, they tied hippies to marijuana and black communities to heroin, then criminalized both as hard as they could, so they could raid the homes, break up the meetings, and jail the leaders. Now, a fair warning. Ehrlichman was dead by the time that quote was published in 2016, and his family flatly disputes that he ever said it. So take the confession itself with caution. But you don't need the confession. Just look at what the policy did. It didn't matter what Ehrlichman meant. What mattered was where the cuffs landed. Here's the record, and the record isn't in dispute. Black Americans and white Americans use illegal drugs at roughly the same rates, always have. But under the war on drugs, Black Americans were arrested for it far more often, and, according to the US Sentencing Commission's own analysis, handed substantially longer sentences for the same crimes. The system didn't treat the sick. It sorted them, and it built the largest prison population on Earth doing it. At the peak, the United States, with about 5% of the planet's people, held nearly a quarter of the planet's prisoners. We didn't lead the world in curing addiction. We led it in caging the addicted. Even now, more than 4 out of every 10 people in federal prison are there on a drug charge. The machine protected itself the way these machines always do, by making enforcement pay and making treatment suspect. Every methadone clinic became a fight. Every dollar for recovery had to be clawed back from a budget that assumed the answer was another cell. And the truth only really surfaced late. It took journalists like Dan Baum publishing that Ehrlichman account in Harper's in 2016, and historians like David Courtwright and Nancy Campbell digging through the wreckage of the Narcotic Farm to show Americans the whole shape of it, that this country manufactured its own addiction crisis in the pharmacy, then criminalized the people it had made, then buried the fact that it had once, briefly, known how to help them. We had the cure in 1964. We chose the cage. And Americans have been dying of that choice ever since. Because the epidemic never ended. It just changed costumes 3 times. The CDC counts 3 waves. Wave 1 began in the late 1990s when a company in Connecticut sold America a new prescription painkiller, OxyContin, as a safe, low-abuse answer to pain. The exact same lie Bayer told in 1898, in a new bottle. Medicine cabinets filled up, and a new generation got hooked by prescription, just like that middle-class woman in 1900. At the peak, in 2012, American pharmacies filled more than 255 million opioid prescriptions in a single year, enough for a bottle for roughly 4 out of 5 adults in the entire country. Wave 2 hit around 2010, when the pills got harder to get, and people chased the same relief to a cheaper street drug, the old one. Heroin came roaring back. Studies found that roughly 3 out of 4 people who got addicted to opioids in the 2000s had started not with heroin, but with a legal prescription. Wave 3 is the one killing us now. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid so potent that a lethal dose fits on the tip of a pencil. Add it up, and more than 1 million Americans have died of drug overdose since 1999. More people than live in the entire city of San Jose, California, gone. There is some real light. 2025 saw an estimated 69,973 overdose deaths, the 3rd straight year of decline, and the lowest count since 2019. But that's still around 190 Americans dead every single day. And where does this whole story physically live in your life right now? The same place it started, a pharmacy shelf. Walk into a CVS or a Walgreens today and you can buy Narcan, the overdose antidote, naloxone, right off the rack, no prescription, over the counter, exactly the way you once bought heroin cough syrup. 1 aisle over sits the modern medicine chest full of the painkillers that started Wave 1. And methadone, the treatment we've had since 1964, the one that works, is still fenced off from most people, handed out through a few thousand tightly controlled federal clinics, often in person, often 1 single daily dose at a time. That's not a medical rule. That's the ghost of 1971. It's the decision to treat the addict as a suspect, still breathing 100 years later. Slow down with me for a second, because this is the whole thing. Heroin addiction was never really a story about a drug. It's a story about a choice this country keeps making. Sell dependence as a cure, then punish the people you created. Morphine was sold as the safe fix for opium. Heroin was sold as the safe fix for morphine. OxyContin was sold as the safe fix for pain. Every wave arrived wrapped in the same promise. This one is different. This one is medicine. This one won't hurt you. We are a country that believes in free markets, in honest medicine, in equal justice under the law. This story is what happened in the gap between those promises and the receipt. So here's a question, and I'm not going to answer it for you. How many of the things running your life right now were sold to you as the cure for the last thing that was sold to you? Sit with that one. Have you ever known someone caught in this? A family member, a friend, a name you still say quietly? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the real history behind the things that run your life, subscribe. Hit the like button. It genuinely tells me to keep going deeper, and share this with someone who thinks they already know how the world works. Because the next time you walk past the pharmacy counter, the Narcan on one shelf, the painkillers behind the glass on another, I want you to remember that both of them were once sold to Americans as medicine. The needle, the syrup, the pill, the antidote, all of it medicine. The only thing that ever really changed was which one we decided to call a crime.